Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenas tardes. Gracias a todas y a todos los que nos acompañan en esta transmisión. En nombre de la Secretaría de Cultura del Gobierno de la Ciudad de México, el Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes y Literatura, la Coordinación Nacional de Artes Visuales del INVAL y el Laboratorio Arte Alameda, les damos la más cordial bienvenida a la charla Decolonizar la tecnología, cómo ver, sentir y escuchar otras frecuencias. Esta cuarta charla del segundo eje temático Arte, tecnología y tiempo ancestral, un paradigma no occidental, se realiza en el marco del ciclo Escucha, profunda, poéticas hacia el mundo, revés. Esta tarde contamos con la presencia de Sara Garzón, curadora y escritora, quien además tiene a su cargo la curaduría de este ciclo y moderará en esta ocasión la conversación entre Nicole, artista transdisciplinaria, y Tiara, Roxanne, ciberfeminista, académica y artista. Mi nombre es Pau Gallardo, soy subdirectora del Laboratorio Arte Alameda y les agradezco nuevamente a todas y a todos por acompañarnos. Voy a leer unas breves bio para dar la palabra a Sara. Comienzo con Nicole, quien nace en Santiago de Chile, es artista transdisciplinar que trabaja con sonidos, vibraciones y múltiples transducciones para explorar el sonido como material de construcción que entrelaza agencias desde lo micro a lo cósmico y estimula nuevos imaginarios, sensibilidades y colectividades. Actualmente, ella es candidata doctoral en artes mediales y ciencias en el MIT Media Lab. Tiara Roxanne es ciberfeminista, académica y artista indígena mestiza radicada en Berlín. Su investigación y práctica artística investiga el encuentro entre indigeneity y América Latina al interrogar las estructuras coloniales integradas en los sistemas de aprendizaje automático. Su trabajo explora la noción de que la descolonización no es posible, por lo que debemos establecer gestos decoloniales, un concepto que desarrolló en su disertación Recovering Indigeneity, Territorial Dehiscence and Digital Immanence, quien completó bajo la supervisión de Catherine Menabo. De esta manera, los gestos decoloniales se presentan como fuerzas y modos de acciones encarnadas decoloniales o antidecoloniales. Además, como artista de performance y practicante, trabaja entre lo digital y lo material a través del textil. Actualmente, su obra está mediatizada a través del color rojo. Finalmente, y con esto cedo la palabra a Sara Garzón, presentaré a Sara, quien es curadora y escritora colombiana radicada en Nueva York. Ha sido nombrada The Andrew Harris Postdoctoral Fellow de la Universidad de Vermont y es actualmente candidata a doctorado en Historia del Arte de la Universidad de Cornell, donde se especializa en prácticas de arte contemporáneo, específicamente en América Latina. Más allá de su investigación doctoral, Sara se ha desempeñado como Jane and Morgan Whitney Curatorial Fellow y Litchfield Strange Curatorial Intern en el Metropolitan Museum of Art. Antes de eso, trabajó en el Brooklyn Museum y en el Museo del Barrio de Nueva York. Pues entonces cedo la palabra a Sara y comenzamos esta charla. Gracias por acompañarnos.
Muchas gracias, Paola. Before starting, I would like to thank the team at Laboratorio de Arte Alameda, Gerardo Cedillo, for their work and dedication in making this public program possible every week. Finally, I would also like to thank Tiara and Nicole for joining us on this journey to think about how to better establish and practice methodologies of care. For the outset, this inquiry about the influence that indigenous social philosophies can have to paradigmatically transform art institutions led us to ask, how can we reimagine our institutions so as to help sustain a struggle for repair and towards a space of mutuality? A place oriented towards other modalities of knowledge that can help us rethink the perspective of a single world, the world that the West and modernity at large have hegemonized as the only possible world. In this section of public programs, which we've titled Art, Technology, and Ancestral Time, a Non-Western Paradigm, we want to inquire into frameworks for decolonizing technology, meaning explore definitions and approaches to the technological that can disavow the self-proclaimed universality of Western technology. It is our honor to be able to count with both of your perspectives as to the role that indigenous cosmovisions, history, and lived experience play in the construction of new sensibilities towards the technological. Technology is really not about technical apparatuses or tools. It is rather a logic that ascertains a particular relationship between humans, nature, and ancestors. This insistence in new yet millenarian understandings of the technological pertains to an effort to investigate relational practices that start from an ontology rooted in place, situated from a territory and its inhabitants, and oriented towards reciprocity, mutuality, and solidarity. Although the relationship between art and technology is central to both your research, this conversation is actually less so about the technological aspects of your work and more so about the sensibilities, frequencies, and deep listening that your artistic practice invokes. We're curious to learn and hear more about how your practices tune us into other modes of listening and connecting with human and more than human actants. How can your practice move us away from sight and looking as the most prominent ways to engage and navigate the world? How do you use technological thinking to heal and cure the colonial wound, that which Rolando Vázquez in his introductory lecture defined as modernist denial and negation of epistemologies outside and beyond those central to Western Cartesian thinking? With those questions and provocations, I would like to turn to Nicole and give her the opportunity to talk to us about her practice and her some of her most interesting work. Thank you and welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Sara, for the wonderful introduction and your kind words and the invitation to put us in dialogue. Let me share my screen. Give me 1 second, please. So I'm going to start by thanking you again. Thank you for your attention too. It's an honor for me to be digitally here with you and engage in this conversation with my colleagues. Just as an introduction, I wanted to tell a little bit about my work. And my work centers on the research and exploration of sound as a construction material. This is a construction material that interweaves agencies from microscopic to the cosmic, and that also stimulates new imaginaries, sensibilities, and collectivities. Under this frame, a very important topic I practice is more than human performativity. We can think about sounds and vibrations that can thread, that can bring us in proximity with other dimensions of animacy and dynamism as well. I believe profoundly that the understanding of a vibrational ontology can give us a series of strategies to reinforce our resonances and alliances with other bodies, human or more than human. This is something like understanding ourselves as part of a reality where everything is in constant oscillation, resonance, and thus relation. Let's say that I study sounds and vibrations to be able to create collective rights, resonant rights, from multi-species, a multi-scalar, multi-agential, planetary, and cosmic perspective. I work with new and ancient technologies, and I tend to infiltrate somehow in different disciplinary spaces and use these fissures as opportunities to destabilize hegemonic anthropocentric perspectives. And also, by doing so, explore the colonial ways of imagining and being between worlds. This has been for me, all this research and exploration and work, some sort of vessel where many things intertwine, such as disciplines, temporalities, cosmologies, ritualities, states of consciousness, different types of intelligences, and also imaginaries. So for me, one central part of this whole research and work, I frame it under the idea, the concept, and the territory of la membrana, the membrane. And it starts by understanding that since everything that is matter has the capacity of vibrating and resonating, we live in a vibrational reality where nothing is static and things exist in constant oscillation, even our reality or multiple realities, let's say. For me, to think membranically means to be a body in oscillation. It means to think and experience in constant relationship with others. It means to be performative and in constant flux. Everybody is let's say, like some sort of particle of this larger distributed membrane that is in constant construction and rearticulation. Under this focus, the social fabric, or maybe, as I prefer to say, the social membrane, also includes bodies that are not human, incorporating other types of subjectivities and sensory registers into the conversation. This way, I think that exploring the membrane can provide a territory that consolidates a more transversal and hybrid order, some sort of place where we can inhabit time in our terms and inhabit our times in some way. The membrane, this way, has very stimulating and productive features that allow transductive and vibrational ways of thinking and being in the world. La membrana, the membrane, produces and receives vibrations. It is a porous boundary that can both separate and connect. It is, let's say, some sort of threshold that is activated by vibrations. So I am devoted to exploring the membranes as a physical and theoretical place for ontoepistemological reconfigurings. In order to gather a little bit some parts of my work that I want to present here, I'm going to present some groups of projects that I'm calling, they're all listening exercises. This would be all mediated listening exercises. I think that it's very important to learn or to relearn how to listen, in some ways recalibrating the senses and make a shift to decenter the predominancy of the visual in Western society towards the sonic and invisible. And this way, try to change how we live and relate with the world we are part of. These are all exercises to inhabit time, really, to reorient our senses and learning to listen as an act of empowerment and a place of interdependency. And also, of course, remembering that we don't only listen through our ears. So this first group, it's a group that I call Resonance and Transductions. And I want to mention something about resonance. And I like to think of resonance as a quality of sound to being insistent, kind of like sound making a point and behaving it in its own terms as well. I think it is a fundamental characteristic of the agency of sound, and a place where I personally have learned to step aside and leave space to it, to be able to behave erratically outside of human control. Then what I mean by transductions, transductions is a process through which, one form of energy is converted into another. For example, we can think about audition as a series of multiple transductions, where a transduction takes place when sound waves are converted into electrical impulses that are interpreted in the brain as sounds, for example, sounds inhabiting different mediums, and it's a form of energy that is always conducting and it's always existent and transforming. So let's say that as a form of energy, sounds are always being transformed and transferred to exist in multiple media forms and dimensions. And in this series of work, I have been focusing on how to actually invite resonance and transductions as active participants in the work that I do. In this context, I wanted to briefly show this piece that is called La Paracantora. This is a project that actually sets the ground for a lot of my work, and not only this project, but it starts from the notion that there is no such thing as empty space. And as Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blaser says, the absence of our image does not reflect nothingness. So starting from there, La Paracantora is a traveling transductive tower, an artifact with different environmental sensors that are sonified in real time. This is some sort of like technological parasite, if you want. It acts like some sort of medium that goes places. It's like it creates a bridge between worlds, offering a listening moment of the silenced voices that our human perception forgot to listen. So this device was for me some sort of documentation tool. It started in these residencies that I did in the Alma Observatory, in the Atacama Desert, as well as in CERN in Switzerland. So the Paracantora was like this note-taking device to access these places from other sensibilities. These places that are so, I don't know if iconic is the word, but so, it's a place where the earth becomes a sensor, and somehow nature and culture, they crash and collide. So in these places, there's many disturbances and affectations about this. So how do we access this by the sonic? So in each of these places, the Paracantora offered a listening right for a specific sonic poem for, specific moments in space and time. Then another type of, another group, it's about communication and transmission. And this refers to a series of experiments around interspecies pirate radio shows. These type of projects, they come all from the idea of reappropriating the airwaves space that has been drastically regulated, privatized, and institutionalized. So the idea is to find venues to open up the mic for other voices that are not only human, and also open up finding these venues outside of the gallery space. This taking it outside of the gallery touches with another important aspect of this project, which is actually exploring radio as a medium to create invisible and mobile architectures that can traverse walls or other arbitrary borders. Then we go to a group that is called Sonic Imagination and the Pluriverses. Sorry. Okay, so this group of the Sonic Imagination and the Pluriverses, it's a bunch of exercises that have to do with imagination and world-making practices. So let's think that sound not only can stimulate other perceptual orders, but can also open up portals to connect to other worlds and realities by guiding us through different mental states, for example, induced by certain frequencies and patterns. In this way, sound can also be a vessel to go through realities and dimensions. I would like to center in one specific piece that is very dear to me, and it's very interesting because it came from sound as an originator, as the genesis of this piece. It came to be through sound, and a little bit reverting the usual, which would consist on starting from the visual, a plan, for example, a score. This is how we build a world. An image that prompts ways of sounding. So in this case, this series of worlds arises from sound itself. This piece is a vessel to rearticulate reality and understand that when we project futures, we are changing the way that we relate to our present and also past. This sonic poem called Nampunguangulenfe, Napunauta, was done in collaboration with my dear friend and amazing feminist Mapuche poet, Daniela Catrileo. We did this poem some years ago as we look to hybridize contemporary Western technologies for space exploration with ancestral technologies for space exploration from the Waimapu territory in the very south of Abya, where Daniela's peoples are from. This poem, let's say, that aims to be a constructor of new mythologies that can help us navigate currently hybridized realities to heal and also to empower, as well as to trouble dichotomies that have been imposed by the West. The initial drive came from research we were doing at the time about colonialism and extraction in space exploration. This, of course, this poem, it's pays homage and is very inspired by the Afrofuturist movements and the importance of understanding the importance of telling stories that challenge hegemonic perspectives in a very multiple and non-linear cosmic imaginaries. So for this, Daniela actually wrote the poem about cosmic travels from her cosmovision and perspective, something that has been a thing since the beginning of times and does not require to burn any fossil fuels, for example. And as we can always simultaneously exist in multiple dimensions. So through that sonic poem, we started opening up this dialogue where then I answered with certain sounds and she collected other sounds, and like we created this dialogue until we constructed this poem. So please.
Ale, 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 ale. I love. Paz. F. Anh. Ê. F. Mari. Resplandecemos como astros, ni, upan, mel, hula, epu, ale, 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 aluf, 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 af, ef, ang, eu. Ale, ale, ale,
Mar,
ale, ale,
aire,
ale,
agua,
ale,
verde, calle,
alof,
ketchup,
alof,
mel, af, hula, an,
ah,
epu, quiñe,
ef, an, eu, ef.
Navegamos hacia arriba en Mapu en el río del Umpam, Mapu en el río Umpam, resplandecemos como astros que escriben el ale, 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 alfe, bien, wanglen, ante. Mapu, nauta.
Thank you for your attention. That's an excerpt of the poem. The original piece is it's 20 minutes long, so a little bit of a tiny listening excerpt for you. And then I wanted to go to the next group that it's called plasmatic listening apparatuses. And this group of experiments put on the center acts of listening and the practices of escucha profunda that gather us today. And most importantly, I must say that as a vibrational researcher myself, I have come to learn that listening is really hard and requires a lot of effort. And there are so many things and like unknown things that we can learn and unlearn if we listen more, to be honest. And also, I must say that as a sonic investigator and musician, I have also come to learn the importance of cultivating a practice of listening in order to emerge together, agglutinate and become collective, like as improvisational forms, for example. In spite of this and this importance and focus that I give to this in my practice and research, we should also not romanticize listening, since this can also promote ways of surveillance, extraction, and control, for example. We must learn somehow how to listen with care and respect. On these terms, we should learn from Indigenous scholar Dylan Robinson's invitation to practice listening without hunger. Then in here you can see two projects. One is called Mis Orejas and consists of a tangled cluster of ears that engages with the tactile and intimate dimensions of listening. These are very soft, touchy, rubbery listening apparatuses made from a mold of my ears. And they are like tentacles. They extend far away from my body. And by doing so, we become a body, a collective body, a multiple. They also become a body of their own. They go to places without me. This has been a response to distance and isolation the past year, and understanding what does it mean to listen and participate in conversations with this distance. What does distance mean in listening? And as I listen to what they listen to, I reflect on the politics of listening, consent, presence, and vibrational intimacy. The distant listening was a way of being together and inhabiting outside of the present time and space, let's say. Inhabiting outside of present seemed to be important for this piece. This piece opened up for me many other questions about affective and atemporal dimensions of listening. Then the other project that you see there called Membranas, it's part of this larger installation that I'm working right now, so it's work in progress. But this is an example of an early prototype of this pink plasmatic listening apparatus that aims to be some sort of like anti-surveillance microphone that somehow meshes sounds into collectivity. It carries the idea of problematizing what a signal means and to explore the possibilities of noise and anti-intelligibility as a place for collective vibrational emergence. This project started with the objective of listening to the wind and voices traveling within it. And by doing so, I actually encountered and sort of fell in love with this paradox of creating a microphone for wind that has always been historically in terms of like Western technology, an element that has always been filtered out. It's an element that produces a lot of noise, so it has been filtered out in order to focus on other signals in sake of productivity and surveillance. Let's say that this membrana invites every little vibration in the air to shake the reality in order to reorient our senses, ways of being, ways of knowing, and ways of relating to this world. And lastly, I wanted to present a recent project that is called Semilla. This semilla or seed is a sonic capsule that is given as an offer to the earth. It is a symbolic act of resonance and mutual care. For this semilla from the underground emits a subtle sound, a sound piece composed with the resonant frequencies of our planet. In order to listen to it, we must reorient ourselves towards the earth and put our bodies and ears in contact with her. This seed is a symbolic piece that marks the beginning of something that grows in time, like a seed, like an idea, but also like a movement. It is also a resonant element that actually protects the place it is buried, since it produces noise and unwanted vibrations that render the place unsoundable and like invisible for extractive telluric sensors and geophones used by oil and gas companies to find new places for extraction. So this way, Semilla is an element of active protection and mutual care. I developed with this piece a manual that has the objective to operate like a tool for disseminating and spreading this underground resistance of the semilla. I'll leave you with a few sounds. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
That's so interesting. Thank you. Looking forward to this.
Of course. Next, we'll have Tiara Roxanne. Welcome, Tiara.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah, for the introduction, and Nicole. That was super fascinating and incredible, relevant work. Thank you so much for sharing what you shared. I was having like a little dance session with the semilla. I wanted to keep going, but I stopped. So yeah, thank you everyone for your energy and presence today. Thank you, Sarah, for your generous invitation. I wanted to start by introducing myself and say a bit about my work, where I come from and what I do. My name is Tiara Roxanne. I'm a researcher and artist based in Berlin. On my father's side, I'm Tarascan indigenous from the land of Michoacan. On my mother's side, I'm Apache, Pueblo Indian, and Italian. I am indigenous mestiza. Sometimes it feels like there isn't a border that hasn't crossed through my blood. In my work, I attempt to demystify settler colonialism embedded within artificial intelligence. Aztecas del Norte, Mojados, Indigenous peoples, First Nations people, mestizos, Redskins, Indians, Native Americans, natives, savages, minorities, at-risk peoples, or asterisk settler colonialist language. The settler names the indigenous person or body, which codifies and marginalizes. Not only does AI learn from these colonial pre-existing biases, it also reinscribes the notion that natives no longer are, but were. As AI codes indigenous bodies, it also classifies these communities into a marginalized digital data set, the asterisk, the code. This digital historicization, or rather erasure of history, necessitates an interference, a non-violent break, a different kind of rupture. Here I summon the source from which indigenous subjectivity originates and encompasses, by returning to the body and the land this body inhabits, by breaking the boundaries it is bound by, and begin to speculate the notion of digital territory, and possibly even digital flesh, one which requires a digital disruption, an interruption facilitated by artificial intelligence. The indigenous body is subject to colonialism, and more specifically, settler colonialism, a term used to describe the colonialist relationship between indigenous peoples and the colonizer. The concept of indigenous here is inspired by Audra Simpson, who states that indigenous is embedded conceptually in a geographic alterity in a radical past as the other in the history of the West. Indigenous peoples are pre-colonial peoples with a narrative that is geographically, cosmologically, and ontologically tied to their land. Their relationship to land and identification as such starts with territory, which carries a polyvalence regarding ancestry, origin, spirituality, and so forth. Spatiality for the indigenous body is both territorial and historical, a byproduct of colonialism, a designation of territorial acquisition and forced migration. In this way, space develops as a gesture of colonization where bodies mimic this system of dominance and subjugate the indigenous body. Such a system aims to create a space of segregation where the indigenous are territorially, socially, and politically trapped. When borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them, the indigenous body is claimed not only by the settler, but also by the borders that surround it. Borders separate the settler from the indigenous, where the settlers make the indigenous their new home and source of capital, and the indigenous are pushed out. This record of geographical domination is also known as settler colonialism, one which occupies and establishes the native land through erasure. This spatial circumscription reattributes the indigenous' overall experience in and of the world. By framing the indigenous body between physical and political structures, and by taking native land, the settler erases indigenous identity and history. This total migration of force pushes the indigenous body into a space of wilderness, the forbidden and the prohibited, the erased, a ghost territory. This demand is a process of naming which determines an engendered locality, that is, coding the body, an ordering of matter around a body. As the indigenous are coded, their body is degenerated from embodied corporeality to mere flesh. Hortense Spillers emphasizes the division between body and flesh by stating that the distinction as the central one between captive and liberated subject positions. In that sense, before the body, there is flesh. That 0 degree of social conceptualization that does not escape concealment under the brush of discourse or the reflexes of iconography. The body that is subjected to, imprinted upon, named, or coded is done so according to the flesh. Where Frank B. Willerson might refer to the presence of the body in reference to Spiller's notion of flesh, for me, the indigenous body who is removed or moved and named suffers a similar antagonism. The indigenous loses their identity as well as their sense of belonging to their homeland. And since flesh is the fundamental indifference between body and world, the indigenous peoples suffer this codification process done so by the settler. Again, Spiller's notion of flesh exemplifies this codification, as the flesh is positioned and held in line with captivity. The flesh that is named and marked is imprisoned accordingly. Here, the marginalized space or territory binds the indigenous body within borders, iconographically and geographically. The settler names the indigenous according to their flesh, which is a codified identification process that further marginalizes the body. This codification of naming a community of bodies or an individual body dehumanizes and colonizes the body being named, anti-named. It is this codifying that then serves as a placeholder for machine learning systems, which conceive and reproduce colonization of the indigenous body, commonly referred to as AI bias. Since machine learning requires the input of categorical data from which AI develops knowledge and understanding, compartmentalization is a fundamental behavior AI undertakes. As AI grows and diversity is tackled through the non-binary, or rather against the universal, we fall into a trap of recolonization or digital colonization. Two terms that digital colonization draws from are data colonialism and digital colonialism. Data colonialism combines the predatory extractive practices of historical colonization with the abstract quantification methods of computing. And digital colonialism is a quasi-imperial power over a vast number of people without their explicit consent, manifested in rules, designs, languages, cultures, and belief systems by a vastly dominant power. Both are hegemonic digital re-inscriptions of historical colonization. More specifically, each use and integrate methods of data collection via algorithms and machine learning systems, which creates a general data identity, stripping away any form of individual or body. This kind of data collection serves as a type of surveillance, which Gary T. Marks called the new surveillance. This new form of surveillance is divvied up in 10 sections, a few of which point directly to the sharing of data, the storing and compressing of data, and specifically that data collection is often done without the consent of the target. Identity is not generally based on the data that is collected. It refuses an ontological perspective. It disavows the body, the being. The historicity one's body carries in body memory and flesh memory is dismissed, overlooked. In other words, the data refuses to acknowledge the marginalized body, the indigenous body in the margins, while remarginalizing it. In turn, this is digital colonization. And since data collection has nothing to do with beingness or the bodily, and because the historicity is so much a part of the indigenous experience, the experience of living, and more generally, it continues to erase history. It persists in colonizing, and thus is how I'm determining digital colonization through data collection systems. Such data collection systems, like the algorithm, are taught by a machine learning, and for example, they collect and produce categories of identification, which further reduces the identity of the indigenous body to a code. Therein lies a danger. The codification process of AI engages in biases that classify, categorize, and codify the indigenous body even further. And because AI learns from pre-existing biases and collects data based on these biases, which further marginalizes, it is not only recolonizing, it is erasing what has not yet been contemporized. AI is learning to perceive the world based on its colonial input and is acting as a disembodied surveillance that recategorizes bodies based on general data collection. Since AI codes and thus digitally colonizes through multiple factors, such as AI surveillance systems and data collection, I want to meditate on the question, can AI provide a space for the indigenous body to digitally reorient? That is to say, we must interrupt AI bias and navigate digitally. Settler colonialism, artificial intelligence surveillance, and data collection compartmentalize the indigenous body, which paralyzes it to a constant state of colonization. I cannot decolonize my body. Now more than ever, with such embedded social, political, and digital hierarchies, the indigenous experience is at risk of historical erasure. The intermingling of each sphere produces a great need for disruption and awakening, not a resistance or recalibration, because remember, computers do not forget. In order to disrupt the pre-existing colonial input of AI, the indigenous body must interrupt their own subjectivity, which relies heavily on history and territory. Herein lies the importance of ontological abstraction. The experience of trauma, whether it be displacement or otherwise, such as ancestral genocide or any other kind of violence against one's body, is ontological because it is implicitly biological and being oriented. An abstraction allows for a different kind of experience or beingness to arrive. I'm certainly inspired by Sylvia Wynter's notion of non-being and the liminal subject regarding the framework of digital flesh. More specifically, Wynter's notions of the liminal subject and the cognitive edge strike a chord when expressing the body as biologic, autopoietic, and perhaps even represented as a multi-species, all of which offer a kind of beginning point for describing digital flesh. The indigenous body must discover a sense of boundlessness that gives way to subjective interruption. Therefore, the indigenous body must re-territorialize, where Guattari says, each one of his organs, his social relations, will in sum find itself repatterned so as to be reaffected, overcoded as a function of the global requirements of the world. To arrive at a space of re-territorialization, the body is placed outside of the parameters it is bound by. This kind of re-territorialization implies the need for a new landscape. By inserting the already codified body into a virtual and boundless landscape, indigenous peoples disrupt their own subjectivity and corporeality, as well as contemporize their bodies as memory systems and flesh. This break in the sphere opens a space for re-articulation, though the indigenous would not re-enter their territory and claim it back, as if that's even possible. The indigenous would need to enter a technological post-humanist framework, the virtual, the digital, via the interface. By arriving into a space that is not named as imperial or colonial as such, because it is its own structure outside of the body, a moving and or malleable structure, it destabilizes normative corporeal thought, that which identifies the body as corporeal flesh, a subjective interruption, a digital disruption. Here, the indigenous body speculates the possibilities of or reprogramming beingness. The indigenous body does not resist or protest digital colonization, but navigates through it by entering digital territory via the interface. Within the digital space, the indigenous body is then overcoded, as Deleuze writes. However, the complexities of subjectivity greatly evolve regarding ethics here, meaning, for example, subjective interruption between a natural world and a non-natural or virtual digital world refers to multifarious meanings that transcend embodiment. The body becomes something else. The body becomes something other than only data. The body becomes digital. The body becomes digital flesh. As the body is placed in accordance with the interface, its meaning and identification extends beyond the boundaries of the embodied, the human corporeal flesh and its nervous system. The indigenous body is no longer human, it is a digital body. and by invocating Bacon's notion of force, where the body serves as a mediating horizon between self and interface, the indigenous body seeks to reestablish a grounding where experience develops as a somatic relationship between self and virtual, self and digital, a boundless space which delineates traumatization by identifying the body beyond the corporeal and symbolic flesh into the space of the digital. Here, I lean into Galloway, where he writes on two kinds of spatial digitality, which are flat digitality and deep digitality. Flat digitality results from the reduplicative multiplexing of the object, and deep digitality results from the reduplicative multiplexing of the subject. Instead of a single point of view scanning a multiplicity of image feeds, deep digitality is a question of multiplicity. Nay, it's an infinity of points of view flanking and flooding the world viewed. These are not so much matrices of screens, but matrices of vision. Thereafter, deep digitality is a kind of digital and territorial unfolding the indigenous body would become into or through, a gesture of reterritorialization, a gesture of rupture, a gesture of decolonization. This is not to say that this decentering of corporeality, this disembodiment, is a positive move toward transcendence. It is only stating that the interface possibilizes a different kind of subjectivity. By revisiting Sylvia Wynter and Frank Wilderson, I wonder if perhaps the refusal of decolonization as possible gesticulates the indigenous body to enter deep digitality or digital territory and become or start to embody digital flesh. Thereafter, both digital territory and digital flesh are possibilized through machine learning and computation and enter a deep digital territory. This kind of embodiment or subjectivity or beingness perhaps is the non to non-being. Of course, one must lean into the metaphor here and think about digitality as immanent, where machine learning possibilizes the indigenous body to become digital flesh, the multi-species, the liminal subject, the body that refuses decolonization, the body that refuses colonization. This is not a sim character or a machinic extension of oneself. It disrupts subjectivity and it mediates beingness outside of the limits of general data collection. It is unknown digital territory. And because it is unknown, it characterizes the uncharacteristic, the non, an imminent adventure within the digital, one that looks back at colonialism and machine learning and enters the rupture. Thank you so much. That is the end of the talk.
That's fascinating, and we don't have more time for other questions, but this has been the beginning of what I hope will be, a long-standing relationships and conversations between the three of us and our audiences as well. And just to finish, I just want to say that I was really captured by this idea of emerging from the rupture of the earth, only because this public program is really asking about materialities of care and healing, and the role, of course, of museums and the curatorial, but also artistic practices and engendering, embodying, and creating these spaces of mutuality and solidarity. And so with that, I just love the possibility of also redefining the terms of, as you stipulated, Tiara, of healing and its kind of impossibility, or under which terms do we seek repair, and redefining those so that the histories of violence are not, erased, right, in this claim and enthusiasm for healing and care. And with that, I just, even the sound pieces and the mechanical kind of, I want to call it metaphors or allegories, the ways in which they become possibilities for engaging in relationalities with the world, have been really provocative, and also helping us understand how museums and museum collections and museum and curatorial doing at large can invoke some of these spaces for bringing our audiences and our publics into further bending and transformation and healing in a way that doesn't essentialize any of these issues or traumas or societal kind of preconceived ideas of what we're doing. So with that, I would love to thank you both for joining us today. And as I said earlier, hope that it would be only the beginning of our exchange.
Yeah, thank you as well. Thanks so much.
Muchas gracias. What a pleasure to be in dialogue with you guys.
Absolutely.
Y bueno, muchas gracias a nuestras invitadas y a todos los que nos acompañaron a través del Facebook Live por hacer posible estos espacios de reflexión. Les recordamos que podemos seguir siendo parte de este ciclo de charlas. El ciclo se llama Escucha profunda, poéticas hacia el mundo al revés. Y es posible gracias a la red de museos del Limbal, al laboratorio Arte Alameda y a todos ustedes que participan con nosotros. Sin más, damos por finalizada esta sesión y agradecemos su presencia. Excelente tarde.